Greetings, colleagues. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this next session with Karsten Steinfatt. We are delighted to have him on the program. We appreciate the experience you have around the world and you bringing us your insights from WTO and the other places that you have had opportunities to both learn and contribute.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to colleagues for the very kind invitation. So I'll be happy to provide some introductory remarks and then answer any questions you may have. So again, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm Karsten Steinfatt. I work at the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. What I would like to do for the next 20 minutes or so is to try to answer two questions. First of all, to give you a sense of how the narrative on trade and environment has evolved over the last few decades. And this will allow us to talk a little bit about the linkages between trade and environment, how each policy domains influences each other. And then I want to look a little bit at what trade and environment issues are currently being dealt with at the World Trade Organization and what are the types of concerns that members have around some of these issues. So the first thing is we go back to the 70s, and I realize many of you probably weren't born at hadn't been born at that time, but that's when you saw the very first wave of environmental regulation in Western Europe, in North America, that came very much on the heels of a rapid period of industrialization after the end of the Second World War. And what you saw at this time very much was that trade and environment were very much presented in terms of a trade-off. You had to either choose between trade or the environment. At the core of this sort of idea was something called the pollution haven hypothesis. This idea that if you have very strict environmental regulations that will impose very high costs for your businesses, which have to comply with that environmental regulations, and that will ultimately undermine competitiveness and eventually lead for businesses moving out of the jurisdiction with the very strong environmental regulations and search for moving to places where environmental regulations are lax. Right, that's the general idea. So if you are in that kind of framework, obviously you will have to choose whether you want to grow now and clean up later, or whether you want to focus on environmental regulations and try to protect your domestic industries from foreign competition, because obviously environmental regulation will impose all these high costs. So at this time, you had very much a discussion about things like green protectionism, the idea that you have to give priority to growth and later to environmental regulation, etc. Right? This was also very much influenced at the time by important works like the Limits to Growth of the Club of Rome, right? A very important book that came out also in the 70s that also very much looked at economic growth and environmental protection as an either-or issue. And to this, we have to add something that happened in the days prior to the creation of the WTO, which was a famous case. Some of you, the lawyers, might know about this, the tuna dolphin case. The tuna dolphin case, in fact, was related to an embargo that the US put in place on imports of Mexican tuna, which had been fished using a technology that had an incidental that resulted in the incidental killing of dolphins, right? And the US imposed this import ban on Mexican tuna. Mexico brought this or initiated a case under, again, this was the pre-WTO days, And the panel that ruled on this issue sided with Mexico. And although the panel report as such was never adopted, in fact, this gave rise to concerns among especially the environmental community that the international trade rules, because we didn't have WTO rules at that time, but these were the rules under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, were unduly constraining countries in the amount of space they had to impose environmental standards and to have ambitious environmental regulation. So this, of course, contributed to this notion, again, that trade and environment were a trade-off, couldn't coexist. Now, if we move forward to today, and of course, I'm simplifying a lot, of course, the discussion, but what we find today is that the view of trade and environment, and more broadly, economy and environment, has changed quite significantly. And today, we see trade and environment much more as complements or having to work as complements. And we actually go as far as saying that trade has to play a role in environmental protection. And that's a big shift from what you saw in the 70s. Of course, today you have concepts, this has all been influenced by concepts like the green economy, green growth, which actually imply that these things, growth, economic growth, and environmental protection need to go hand in hand. So what you've seen here is that this has also influenced the trade and environment debate very, very strongly. And one reason is, of course, that I mentioned before this issue of pollution haven hypothesis, this idea that environmental regulation is very costly for businesses to comply with and thus undermines their competitiveness. Well, there has been a lot of academic work on this issue over the decades, in fact, and we have not found very strong evidence for that, or the evidence has been very mixed. In those cases where we have found that environmental regulation influences trade and investment patterns, that has really been, the effects have been quite small. And so this hasn't really been backed by empirical evidence, this idea that environmental regulation necessarily leads to offshoring of pollution. Another fact that has come out from the recent literature is that, in fact, if you apply environmental regulation that is well designed, that is ambitious, what you're doing is tilting comparative advantage, yes, against polluting industries, but also in favor of clean industries. And that can provide, in fact, a boost to competitiveness in some new emerging industries, be it renewable energy, being more circular economy, business models, etc. So that's one big factor that has influenced the change in the narrative from trade or environment towards a more trade for environment view of things. Another important thing is that we have become much better at life cycle analysis. Of course, there is still a long, long way to go, but life cycle analysis and measuring environmental footprints along the value chain has advanced significantly. This is obviously something that is quite important to a country like New Zealand, which is far from many large markets, right? We have had studies, especially at the beginning of the 2000s, which have shown that, in fact, even though some products travel very long distances in the supply chain, and sometimes they even use very polluting forms of transportation, like air transport, which is very carbon intensive compared to, for example, shipping. If you take account of the entire life cycle of the product, even those that travel long distances will have a lower environmental footprint than some of those that are produced locally. And why is that? Well, because the environmental impact of a product has to be measured along the entire value chain. In other words, from the time it is produced to the time it is consumed and used and consumed. So the transport bit is only a part of what has an environmental impact. We have to look also at how goods are produced, how they are consumed, how they are disposed of. I usually, when I do a training, I use this example of Kenyan roses, which there was a study in 2006 about this, which showed that in fact Kenyan roses flown into the UK from with planes have a much lower environmental footprint than roses produced in the Netherlands and shipped over to the United Kingdom. And this had to do because, of course, in the Netherlands, you needed greenhouses, you needed often heated greenhouses with artificial light to produce these roses, whereas in Kenya, you had less need for energy to produce the roses. The climate conditions, of course, are very different. The soil conditions also require less fertilizer, etc. So this is just to show that also the life cycle analysis is our understanding of that has evolved, and that has also led to the notion that the fact that things are transported over long distances doesn't necessarily mean that their total environmental footprint is heavier than the things that are produced and consumed locally. Although, of course, this is an empirical question, it doesn't mean that something that is traded is necessarily better for the environment. And the other issue, of course, is the broader issue of trade as an important tool for poverty reduction. And if we look at, for example, its relationship to climate change, we will find that trade will play a very important role in the coming decades in order to cushion some of the negative impacts of climate change on, for example, agricultural productivity in some countries. You've probably seen some of these maps that show that countries in, for example, Western Africa, South Asia, will experience, as a result of climate change, very significant drops in agricultural productivity. So in the short to medium term, of course, there is the understanding that trade will help these countries, these regions, to cushion some of the negative impacts that the climate change will have on agricultural productivity and food security. So again, contributing to this idea that trade somehow needs to be part of the equation in environmental protection and in responding to environmental shocks. Finally, I mentioned before the idea of green growth, green economy, these concepts that have of course influenced the narrative on trade and environment. We have had several studies coming out recently that show, in fact, that environmental action can indeed open new business opportunities and bring new opportunities for growth. For example, you have the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which found that world climate action could deliver at least 26 trillion in economic gains through 2030. Similar things have been found for implementing the SDGs in several sectors, and also, of course, with link to the more efficient use of materials and energy. These are things that could deliver net benefits for society if the right incentives are put in place. And of course, this has contributed also to this idea that economy and environment can go hand in hand. At the level of policy, of course, we have seen these new narratives sort of transpire into policies. You see the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which were adopted in 2015. Those SDGs very clearly identify trade as one of the means of implementation, means of, in fact, putting in place the or achieving the different goals, whether you're talking about the environmental goals, the social goals, and the economic goals, right? Trade is identified, as I said, as a means of implementation together with finance, with capacity building, and also technology. So clearly there is a role seen in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development for trade to play a role as a tool, in fact, to achieve these SDGs. You've also seen more integration of environmental elements in free trade agreements, right? Here you see a chart. In the horizontal axis, you see the years in which the FTA came into force. The vertical axis, you see the number of environmental provisions in these FTAs, these free trade agreements. And what you see very clearly is that over time, FTAs contain more and more environmental provisions. Of course, this is somewhat of a blunt measure. It doesn't look at the quality of those environmental provisions, it just counts them. But clearly you see that recent agreements like CPTPP, which New Zealand is a party, of course, contain lots and lots of environmental provisions and put quite a bit of focus on environmental protection as part of the overall trade agreement. At the WTO, we see a similar trend. We see that the number of measures notified to the WTO under different agreements, member countries have to, for transparency reasons, notify certain measures that are trade-related to the WTO to enhance transparency. And what we see over the years is that more and more of these measures have an environmental goal, which points to the fact that countries are using trade policies related measures more and more to achieve environmental objectives. And this goes from technical regulations, for example, energy efficiency standards for household goods or emission standards for cars, all the way to government support programs, for example, for renewable energy producers, or taxes on carbon, taxes on plastic pollution and waste, import bans on also some waste products, etc., etc. So all these measures that are very much trade measures are being used and implemented to achieve environmental goals. Finally, at the WTO level, of course, we have seen a shift, of course, in the emphasis on environmental issues. I talked a little bit about the predecessor of the WTO, the GATT, which was really not mentioning environment or sustainability at all. And this changed dramatically with the creation of the WTO in 1995, which explicitly in its founding charter, the Marrakesh Agreement explicitly recognizes sustainable development and the optimal use of resources in accordance to that objective of sustainable development as a goal of the organization. So here it's not the WTO, again, promoting trade for the sake of trade, but promoting trade in order to achieve or to promote human well-being. Of course, environmental healthy planet, environmental protection is an important part of this. And this, of course, has very much informed the interpretation of the rules. I talked before about the tuna dolphin case. Well, this case was re-examined or examined again under WTO rules. And this time around, the appellate body found that, in fact, the US measure to prohibit imports of tuna from Mexico that had been fished using certain technologies that harmed dolphins was, in fact, aligned with WTO rules. Once the protectionist elements of that of the US measure were eliminated. So a big shift in the way also that the rules are interpreted. And now we have quite a number of cases at the WTO which deal with environmental issues. And one can say from that quite clearly that members do have quite significant space to adopt ambitious environmental policies, and that even some that are, in fact, very trade restrictive, like in the case of the US on imports of tuna, it was a ban, so a very restrictive trade measure. Members can adopt these types of policies as long as they do not use them for protectionist reasons, to protect their domestic industry, as long as the measures are used, in fact, to promote an environmental objectives, not to promote the local industry, protect the domestic industry from foreign competition. They will certainly pass WTO muster. At least that's what the cases until now show quite clearly. So at the WTO also we have a committee on trade and environment, which was created again when the WTO was created 25 years ago. And it is a dedicated forum, in fact, that deals exclusively with this relation of trade and environment, trying to help the understanding, advance the understanding of trade officials in Geneva and in capitals about what are the environmental issues that are on the environmental policy agenda, how and exchange experiences on how trade policies can contribute to support those environmental policy agendas. So this is to say that we do have a basis at the WTO, a good foundation, in fact, to use this new narrative of trade for environment and turn it into action. Of course, where we haven't seen as much progress at the WTO is in turning the narrative of trade for environment into actual concrete trade policy changes, right, at the global level. We have a few things in the pipeline, and you will probably speak much more about the issue of fisheries subsidies. I understand Alice Tippings will be talking to you about this later on in the program. We also have an initiative on opening trade in environmental goods and services. And I want to pause a little bit on this to explain what the rationale is of this. One area which WTO members have identified as potentially contributing to environmental protection is the actual trade in green technologies, right? Not every country can quickly produce all the technologies that are needed to protect the environment and to deal with a whole sort of environmental challenges, right? So they will, of course, trade provides a very convenient and very effective tool to access those technologies. And in the process, it also provides producers of these technologies the possibility to source inputs from the most efficient resources. It also provides them the possibility to reap economies of scale. So all of this very much contributes to lowering the price of green technologies. We had a World Bank study a few years ago that showed that if you eliminated barriers to trade in some particular technologies, you would see big increases in the demand, in the consumption of those and the use of those technologies. And this has to do, of course, with the fact that trade helps, an open global trading system helps reduce the prices of technologies. And you see there the estimates that they provided. And yet we see, as you see in the case of the wind turbine, that there are still a lot of tariffs and sometimes pretty high tariffs imposed on different parts of a wind turbine, which increases the cost, in fact, of the final product. So the idea here for WTO members is to come together and agree on a list of environmental goods that you could actually reduce tariffs on them. Right? And this has already been done at a smaller scale in the context of APEC. APEC had an agreement on environmental goods. They included 54 environmental goods. And at the WTO, the idea was that the environmental goods agreements would then take the APEC deal and try to build on it. There has not been yet a successful outcome to these negotiations, but certainly a lot of interest in continuing them and reaching eventually an outcome. Here you see some of the categories of products that have been considered in the context of these environmental goods agreements. So it's not only about clean and renewable energies, it's also about air pollution control, environmental regeneration, resource efficiency, waste management. Finally, on emerging issues at the WTO, there are quite a few. Of course, one that New Zealand is very interested in pursuing is to try to explore the role of the WTO in helping countries eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, which, as you know, encourage consumption of fossil fuels and what is related to them, greenhouse gas emissions and the resulting pressures on climate that result from that. So this is, again, somehow akin to the fisheries subsidies negotiations. It's trying to see how WTO rules, which there are already rules on subsidies, how these rules can be improved in order to agree to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption of fossil fuels. This is, of course, related to the broader issue of trade and climate change, which is also of a lot of interest to our member countries, especially now that the European Union has announced as part of its European Green Deal that it will impose a border carbon tax adjustment to certain imports of products that based on their carbon content. And we can talk a bit more about that later, but this is obviously an issue that raises trade concerns for many WTO members, and they are trying to bring this issue to the WTO, try to start a discussion on this issue. And another set of issues revolves around the resource efficiency and circular economy. Here the question is, how can the trading system create incentives or strengthen some of the incentives in order to move away from a linear economy, which produces, uses, and then wastes or disposes of things as waste, towards more circular business models that try to reuse certain things, try to remanufacture, recycle more, and try to keep resources in use for longer in the economy. And as part of this, of course, there is also an emphasis on the issue of plastic pollution and the role of trade in contributing to that and how that can be, of course, changed. So this is my very last slide. Last week, in fact, we had some very positive developments at the WTO. We had a Trade and Environment Week for the year. And in this context, a group of 50 WTO members decided to launch what they called structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. So a very positive step, because this group has very much emphasized that they want to identify what concrete action they can take on in order to move or increase the coherence between trade and environment. You also had a smaller group of members led by China and Fiji that decided to launch an informal dialogue on plastics pollution and a sustainable plastics trade. So another very positive development, which could eventually lead again to concrete actions. And you have continued discussions on circular economy, which is also another topic of interest to our members. So I guess I'll stop here. And yes, I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karsten. It's been a very generous conversation. It will inform us and influence us a lot as we debate these issues, both at the school, at the conference, and in the coming months. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Hello everyone, I'm Maureen Benson-Rea of the University of Auckland, and I'd like to thank the Public Policy Institute for the invitation to participate in this important and interesting event. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Alice Tipping is Lead Fisheries Subsidies at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Alice has designed and led highly respected programs of research and policy dialogues on trade and environmental issues, particularly on fisheries subsidies. Alice has a deep understanding of the intersection of foreign policy, law, and environmental protection that's informed by roles in government and in managing policy-relevant research. Her previous roles include Program Manager, Environment and Natural Resources for the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development, Policy Advisor to New Zealand's Permanent Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Second Secretary and Legal Advisor to New Zealand's Permanent Mission to the WTO, and Policy Advisor and Legal Advisor at New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Alice has an MPhil in International Relations from Cambridge University and Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Commerce and Administration degrees from Victoria University of Wellington here in New Zealand. The title of Alice's talk today is Trade and Sustainability, New Issues, Old Issues. And Alice, thank you very much. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Kia ora everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to make a contribution to this year's Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School. My name is Alice Tipping, and I work for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD. We're a think tank based in Canada, but with a large office in Geneva, from which we do a lot of research and policy dialogue work on trade and sustainable development issues. Our funding comes from a number of different foundations and national governments, including that of the United Kingdom and New Zealand, and I acknowledge both of those contributions with gratitude now. I would have loved to have been with you in person, but in the current circumstances, I think a video will have to suffice. I've been asked by the organisers to give you an international perspective on the substance of some of the headline issues around trade and sustainable development, the substance and the politics. I thought I'd start by giving you an overview of what's on the agenda at the international level, and then explore two newer issues on the agenda and two issues that have been on our agenda for rather longer, but are enjoying a new lease of life, as it were. So to give you a sense of the waterfront of issues people are talking about, I thought I'd take as reference the set of sessions on sustainability that were organised as part of the Geneva Trade Week, which was a week-long jamboree of WebEx dialogues for trade nerds that was organised in October in place of the WTO's public forum. Now, if you missed it, don't worry, all the sessions are recorded and available on YouTube. IISD helped to curate a set of sessions focused on sustainability, and we managed to whittle down 34 proposals to 14 sessions, which covered the following topics: the circular economy and plastics pollution, fisheries subsidies, several around climate change, including fossil fuel subsidies and border carbon adjustments, questions about biodiversity, natural resources, and the link to zoonotic diseases, and then several issues that were less new but still crucial for sustainable production. That's food security, the financing of agricultural production, supply chains, and voluntary sustainability standards. I'm going to focus in the next few minutes on the first four topics. That's the circular economy and plastics pollution, fisheries subsidies, and fossil fuel subsidies. And the last two are, of course, where you're aware, New Zealand has played a really leading role in the international community. So firstly, the circular economy. Now, for those not familiar with the jargon, the circular economy, which is a term coined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is the idea that we should progressively reduce the amount of waste we create and the burden our economy places on natural resources, be it water, energy, or clean air, basically by doing three things: designing the production and distribution of goods so that products create less waste and less pollution when they're eventually disposed of. The second is lengthening the amount of time we use products and materials, so to reduce the flows of waste into the environment. And the third is to use production processes to regenerate rather than degrade natural systems. Now, obviously, all of this is linked to how businesses operate and to international trade, and it's becoming a topic of much attention in international trade policy discussion. There's already a whole body of work on what the circular economy means for international trade and what its implications could be. And many of them, I think, can be gleaned from this diagram. And I promise this is the most complicated diagram of the whole presentation, so do bear with me, because I think it helps to illustrate a lot of what we're talking about in terms of economic activity and trade. So the thick line that you see in the middle is the standard production model. Moving from left to right, a product is designed, input material is sourced, it's manufactured, delivered, sold, used, and eventually disposed of. And the different coloured arrows all around it represent the new kinds of business models conceptualised by the OECD that are involved in the shift to a circular economy. The red arrows right at the very beginning on the left, at the beginning of the production process, represent circular supply models, so changing the way products are designed so they last longer and providing renewable or recycled inputs to production. The light blue arrows at the bottom represent resource recovery models involved in the recovering or the recycling of products. The orange arrows represent product life extension models, so the repairing, the maintaining, or the remanufacturing of products. The dark blue arrow just above the product use stage represents sharing models like Airbnb, for example, that involve sharing goods while they would be otherwise unused. Now, what's interesting here is that services are also sold with or instead of goods themselves in product as a service models, and that's the light green arrows at the top. So as you can probably imagine, there are many interactions with international trade here. On the side of trade in physical goods, you might trade waste for recycling somewhere else, and then trade the secondary raw materials that come out of the recycling process. You might trade secondhand goods, like secondhand cars, to be reused somewhere else. You might also trade goods for repair or remanufacture. But perhaps most interestingly for this audience, there are many connections to trade in services where a lot of value is often added. And research that we at IISD have conducted with the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra shows that in a survey that included a lot of very outward-looking but very small enterprises of the kind New Zealand has a lot of, many of these enterprises were trading, in many cases entirely digitally, services like research and development services. Many of them were selling tools and systems to other businesses that supported their circular economy activities. So in addition to trade in goods in support of a circular economy, we now have evidence that there's a lot of trade in services and a wide range of services that can support circular economy activities. So briefly, some thoughts about the policy questions that have arisen about this debate. There are some very sensitive issues around trade and waste, particularly following China's decision to ban imports of some waste recently, and the fact that many developing countries don't want to be seen as dumping grounds for developed country waste, but that in fact many developed and developing countries simply don't have the ability to recycle for themselves the waste they create. A similar issue actually arises with second-hand or refurbished goods. Some developing countries are uncomfortable being considered markets for second-hand or remanufactured goods that are perceived as being lower quality than new products. Many of the issues link back to the fact that there's very limited capacity in many developing countries to recycle or responsibly dispose of waste. Simply importing, recycling, or waste management services and technology might be an option, but there's a delicate line in many countries between what are considered municipal services and the competence of the government and what might be open to foreign competition. The last policy question here is the extent to which policy may be lagging a bit behind the very quick uptake of digital business operations and the movement of data as well as goods. We heard in our research, for example, about issues around VAT, value-added tax, and products being moved across borders as part of a packaging rental system, for example, that had VAT applied to them as if they were a good or as if they were a service in different jurisdictions, which added to some complexity. Now, as it happens, the issue of waste management is also central to the second big issue I wanted to cover, which is plastics. So the question of plastic pollution in the ocean has attracted a huge amount of public attention and therefore political attention, and with very good reason. This graph is taken from a recent report by the Pew Charitable Trusts, and it illustrates what we could be looking at in 20 years if we continue to let plastic waste leak into the oceans from landfills, businesses, and our own activities as consumers. we currently place some 11 million metric tons of plastic into the ocean per year. A business as usual scenario, that's the top of the dark blue line on this slide, would lead to triple that level, some 29 million tons entering the ocean every year. Now, moving away from that nightmare scenario into what Pew call a systems change is going to require a number of different shifts, each of which would have an impact on the business as usual scenario, and the impact of which is reflected in a different colour on this graph. So the shifts, broadly speaking, from top to bottom are as follows: reducing the production of plastic, that's the dark blue bits, increasing the use of plastic substitutes, that's the light blue, recycling far more than we currently do, that's the green, reducing to an extent the amount that we dispose of, or doing it better in yellow, and reducing the mismanagement of plastic waste, that's in red. And what the graph shows essentially is that each one of these shifts is needed to change the current economic system around plastics. The challenge, of course, is that plastics are so deeply embedded in everything we use that we're talking here about changes that cut across a wide range of economic activity. So we're working with the few charitable trusts on what the trade policy implications of this systems shift might be, but here are some early points to make. It's a topic of real interest at the WTO. It's been raised at every meeting of the Committee on Trade and Environment since the end of 2016, and several members have notified trade measures relating to plastics to the WTO. Interestingly, most of these notifications have been from developing countries, and they include measures like bans on single-use plastic bags or single-use plastic products like shopping bags. Interestingly, China and Fiji are leading an initiative to establish an open-ended dialogue process to have WTO members discuss how governments can use the trade system to shape trade policy so it addresses plastic pollution, including some motherhood and apple pie issues like transparency around trade measures. A separate point here is that, as we saw with waste more generally just before, there are many sensitivities around trade in plastic. Who's responsible for it, who treats it, who pays for its disposal. Many large businesses, for instance, would like to be able to ship plastic waste internationally so they can move it to recycling or refurbishing plants in different places. But many developing countries are wary of accepting waste in general and often don't have the ability in customs procedures to verify easily what is waste for recycling, which could be accepted, and what's just waste being shipped to them without any oversight. Now, part of this oversight is meant to get better starting next year with the entry into force of several new listings of plastic products on the Basel Convention's annexes. So if a product is listed on the Basel Convention annexes, parties to the convention are obliged to obtain the prior informed consent of a country before waste containing the listed substance is shipped there. But the process of obtaining this consent and the extent to which it's really informed are not smooth at all. The last point, as we saw on the Pew graph, is that better disposal, better recycling and reuse of plastics will go part of the way to solving the problem. But there's still a wave of plastic being produced and coming down the economic pipe towards consumers. So somehow governments are going to need to tackle the overproduction of plastic, either by taxing it or by removing the subsidies that plastic production and its feedstocks enjoy. For those of you who didn't, like I didn't know until a few months ago, plastics are actually made from fossil fuels. So tackling plastics is going to require tackling fossil fuel production subsidies. So fossil fuels and their subsidies have been on the international agenda for a decade now, and the subject of extensive analysis by us at IISD, by UNEP, the OECD, the IEA, and many others, and New Zealand has been one of the most active advocates for their reform. There's been considerable analysis done about how these subsidies encourage the overproduction of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, and how the use of fossil fuels like diesel or gasoline is encouraged by subsidization, and in fact how these subsidies overall hinder the development of renewable energy. There are also a number of wider repercussions like air pollution and simply the overcommitment of public funds that could be better spent on health, education, and social protection outcomes. What's new in the analysis of fossil fuel subsidies, I think, is the focus on the trade impacts they have. And this is work that we've done at IISD that builds on work we've also done for the New Zealand government. I won't subject you to a detailed discussion of this diagram, but the key point is that we now have a clear conceptual framework for understanding how producer and consumer subsidies to fossil fuels distort international trade. This helps, we think, to buttress the argument that fossil fuel subsidies should be addressed at the WTO, because their trade effects are not completely captured by the existing rules and because their environmental effects aren't captured at all. So some very high-level policy points here because it's a topic well known to this audience. First, there's a clear rationale for pursuing action on fossil fuel subsidies at the WTO. The WTO is where our only existing multilateral rules on subsidies sit, albeit those rules affect only the trade effects of subsidies. The question, I think, is what's the best tactic for moving the issue forward at the WTO? You could focus on some kinds of processes, improving transparency, for example, through questions New Zealand and the other friends of fossil fuel subsidy reform have raised in the WTO's trade policy reviews. Or you could think about focusing on some parts of the fossil fuel subsidy problem, those subsidies that present the clearest need for collective international action, for example. One thing that has changed in the last few years is that the fossil fuel subsidies discussion is popping up in other places. So there's potential for some inroads to be made through the discussion on plastics, for example, where fossil fuel subsidies are clearly fueling this wave of plastic heading into the economy. Also, fuel subsidies are one of the most widespread subsidies provided to fishing. So an agreement on fisheries subsidies is already trying to tackle some of the thorny issues around fuel subsidization, like its relationship to tax. And I have to say it's been really interesting sitting in Europe to see the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability initiative and the negotiations under that launched. And this is again where New Zealand is leading the way in developing a high ambition agreement, the first, we think, to tackle fossil fuel subsidies in a really meaningful way, and to pursue that high ambition agreement amongst a smaller group of countries where others can join. Now, of course, we've seen this strategy work before. The P4 agreement, another high ambition agreement signed between New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore and New Zealand back in 2005. And that agreement gradually grew with many additions and transformations to become the CPTPP. And one of the most significant additions we thought in the CPTPP, at least on the environmental side, was the first set of binding rules on fisheries subsidies, subsidies to illegal fishing and subsidies to overfished stocks. And interestingly enough, these two topics appear to have provided inspiration for the WTO negotiations on the same topic. So my last point, negotiations about fisheries subsidies at the WTO. This is an issue New Zealand has actively championed for years and one that New Zealand has been deeply involved in supporting and one that IISD has been engaged in for many years now. It's in fact the only multilateral negotiation underway at the WTO. There are three key pillars of the rules being negotiated: rules on subsidies to vessels and operators engaged in IUU fishing, rules on subsidies to fishing of overfished stocks, both of which should now sound familiar, and last, rules on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. And those might be subsidies to operating costs like fuel and subsidies to capital costs like new engines. Now, one of the most vexed questions in the negotiations, which will in the end, I think, define how much impact the rules have, is how much special and differential treatment is provided to developing country WTO members. And this is particularly tricky in the context of fisheries subsidies because many of the largest subsidizers and many of the largest fishing fleets are from developing countries, China being the case in point. So wide special and differential treatment exemptions from the disciplines that would apply to all developing countries risk undermining the effectiveness of the deal and in fact might make it untenable for some of the more ambitious members. Now, the politics of the trade system's treatment of China in particular have been tense for many years, but have in fact become deeply fractured just in the last 4. So if I can offer some concluding thoughts from the other side of the planet, as trade policy analysts, there's always a risk that when we hold our trade policy hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Trade policy is not going to fix any of these issues on its own, but it can be an important enabler if it's well designed as part of a coherent policy framework that addresses the problem, and if it's part of the work that businesses and regulators make together to move forward. I think we also have to be realistic about what trade policy can achieve. We need to be flexible about how we use trade policy and trade policy institutions. Not every problem requires a legally binding multilateral treaty, at least not at first. If the fisheries subsidies negotiations have taught us anything after 20 years, it's that multilateral work takes a long time, and inevitably trades off, to an extent, inclusiveness and effectiveness. We also see that more trade is not always a good thing. More trade in hazardous waste that recipient countries cannot manage just moves the problem rather than resolving it. Second, we often talk about how we need a WTO that's fit for purpose. And I tend to think we also need to reach some kind of understanding about what that purpose is to work out how to reform the institution to serve it. I'm not sure we've come to that common understanding yet. What's it going to take to get to that common understanding? Well, in a word, leadership. Sometimes it's leadership that forges ahead and shows what's possible, as we hope the ACCTS will do. But we also, rather desperately I fear, need leadership that brings together governments with very different perspectives and helps them to understand each other, and then eventually to trust each other enough to reach collective agreements about how to tackle challenges. Now, this honest broker role is one New Zealand has often played, but the challenge is it's invisible and it's often thankless. You can't often tweet about it, but I do think it's needed now more than ever.
Thank you very much, Alice, for a very interesting overview, combined with some highly relevant policy questions. My own work on circular economy and sustainability in general, since I'm in a business school, looks at firms and consumers as well as the policy context. So in a world where we've seen increasing skepticism about institutions, and arguably is moving more towards deglobalization, my two questions are both about lower level activism, I suppose, not waiting for the big institutions to do something. So my first question is, how do you see the role of activist citizens, consumers and businesses in addressing the issues you've set out? And my second question, crucially for New Zealand, do you see the changing global policy context leading to more activist leadership from smaller countries, such as with P4 and now ACCTS? Thank you.
So now to the questions. On the first, the role of activist citizens, consumers and businesses is still crucial. Politics in many countries appears, to me at least, to be becoming increasingly short-termist, increasingly hyper-responsive to pressure groups. And I often get the sense that governments need civil society to help to create the political space for them to take tough decisions, to keep pushing for strong policies in the common good. So on some issues, like the circular economy, consumers, and I might add investors, are key. Businesses will adjust to whatever course of action minimizes costs, maximizes sales and profit. Governments can regulate to increase costs, but consumers decide what they want to buy. And moving to products that cost more but last longer requires changing what we demand of businesses. On other issues like fossil fuel and fisheries subsidies, it's going to be hard to find businesses that want to give up their subsidies, particularly when their competitors keep them. So the role of civil society, activists, scientists, academia is central. If the classic political economy problem of trade policy and liberalization in particular was that the benefits are widely shared over society, but so widely shared that no one has enough of an interest in pressing for change, while the costs fall narrowly on particular industries who are only too vocal in pressing against change. So civil society needs to be the voice of the collective that benefits from change, and also to create political space for governments to move forward with change. And that means praising them for action on carbon emissions or pollution control or sustainable fishing or logging. And that's exactly what IASD is trying to do in helping to support work on reform of fossil fuel subsidies and also of fisheries subsidies. On the second question, coming back to the question of leadership, there's two aspects here. And there's firstly the sort of build it and they will come reality. Never underestimate the power of agreed language in international relations. Once you've crafted a model or an agreement that addresses a particular problem for the first time, chances are that if it's any good, it will become the template that others look to as well. So there's real proven value in thought leadership. It does make a real difference. And the second aspect, and sort of the question about what's the role for smaller countries, in the clear absence of any large country that wants to take on or continue the US's hegemonic role. Traditionally you would have relied on a hegemon to pay off the various sides of a conflict or a trade deal in order to get it over the line. The United States doesn't appear to be interested in playing that role very much now, and no other country seems willing or able to play it either. So in a multipolar world, maybe the role of smaller countries is to think through and arrange the trade-offs between countries rather than from one large country to everyone else. I hope that's been a useful contribution to the debate, and I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you again.